Title: The Cursed Cleric, The Forgotten Legacy. Prologue. The night the storm broke, everything changed. It wasn't just the wind howling through the trees, or the rain that lashed against the windows like 1,000 whispers of the dead. It was the sense that something ancient and untold was awakening, its cold fingers creeping through the cracks of the world. The kind of storm that seemed to carry with it a terrible weight, like the earth itself was shaking off the remnants of a curse too long buried, too long ignored. Ethan knew it wasn't just a coincidence. There was something more to this storm. A warning, perhaps, or the final cry of a legacy forgotten. As the thunder rumbled like the groans of the long dead, he sat alone in his cramped apartment, the weight of his research pressing down on him. He had spent weeks reading, digging into the dusty pages of history, searching for clues, piecing together fragments of a story long buried beneath layers of family secrets and lies. But no matter how much he uncovered, there was always one question that gnawed at him. Always one truth that he couldn't quite grasp. What happened to the Strathmore family? They had been powerful, influential, feared. Their name had been whispered with reverence and dread in equal measure. But then they disappeared, vanished without a trace. The mansion at the edge of the town was abandoned, left to rot in the harsh winds and relentless rain. The last surviving heir, Victoria Strathmore, had fallen into obscurity, her family's fortune dwindling to nothing. No one knew the truth of what had happened. It was a story lost to time, a mystery that slipped through the cracks of the world, until Ethan found it. The old documents had been tucked away in a forgotten archive, their edges yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. They spoke of something more than just a family's rise and fall. They spoke of a pact, a dark covenant made with powers beyond the understanding of mere mortals, the rights of the dead. A legacy built not on money or land, but on the control of the very essence of life and death. Dead man's rights. At first, he had dismissed it as superstition, the kind of twisted folklore that thrived in the shadows of old estates and crumbling families. But as he pieced the puzzle together, as he dug deeper into the strange rituals that had bound the Strathmores to their wealth and power, he began to feel the cold fingers of truth curling around his throat. And then, when the opportunity to investigate the Strathmore estate presented itself, he had no choice but to accept. What could it hurt? It was just a case, another mystery to solve, another bit of history to unravel. He wasn't prepared for what he would find there. No one could have been. The Strathmore legacy was no mere family history. It was a curse that lived on, that survived through every generation, every bloodline, feeding on the souls of the dead and the living alike. And Ethan, in his relentless pursuit of the truth, had unknowingly walked right into its grasp. The storm raged on outside, its fury matching the turmoil inside his mind. He glanced at the stack of papers on his desk, the names and dates, the cryptic rituals, the faded photographs of people long forgotten. His fingers hovered over the old journal, the one belonging to Victoria Strathmore herself, the last member of the family. He had seen the mansion in his dreams, dark, imposing, a monument to a family's greed. And now, with each passing hour, it felt less like a dream and more like a calling. The storm didn't feel like an accident anymore. It was the beginning. Chapter 1. The Reluctant Priest, Expanded. Father Elias had never been one to believe in omens. He had grown up in the practical world of theology, where faith was a matter of scripture and discipline, not superstition. His life had been steeped in doctrines, his days filled with prayers and rituals, but they had never felt like the sacred acts he had been taught they should be. After years in the bustling heart of the city, where people came and went like faceless shadows, Elias had slowly begun to lose his connection with his own faith. It was like the rhythm of the prayers no longer echoed in his chest, like the weight of the incense no longer enveloped him in sacred warmth. In truth, he hadn't been sure why he had stayed in the priesthood for as long as he had. Perhaps it was duty, or perhaps it was the fear of questioning something he had been taught was unshakable. But Ashdown was different. The town was not far from the main road, nestled between the mountain passes in the northern reaches of the country. It felt ancient, as if it existed outside the usual flow of time. When Father Elias had received his letter of assignment, a formal request to take over the duties of the late Father Gabriel, He had wondered why such a request had come his way. Ashdown wasn't known for being a thriving community. The parish had been small, almost non-existent in terms of visitors. Still, it was a calling, and a priest didn't refuse a calling, no matter how odd it might seem. He packed his bags and made the journey. The drive had been long and solitary, the road winding through thick forests and past silent fields. The moment Elias entered the village, he felt an unsettling silence settle over him. The air was heavy, thick with an almost oppressive stillness. The trees seemed to lean toward the road, their twisted branches like the gnarled fingers of some ancient creature reaching out to grasp him, and yet they never moved. They merely watched, observing. The village was small, though not quite in a way that was comforting. It seemed like an abandoned place, but with just enough signs of life to make it feel haunted. The houses were cobbled together in a way that suggested generations of reluctant repairs. Some windows were cracked, others entirely missing. But still, Elias saw lights flickering behind some curtains. Dim, sickly yellow lights that never seemed to go out. The streets were narrow, some cobbled with stones, others just dirt paths, trampled over by shoes that had left permanent marks. Father Elias pulled his car into the small, dilapidated churchyard. His eyes were drawn immediately to the church itself, which seemed out of place among the village's decaying houses. The church was ancient, its stone exterior weathered by centuries of neglect. The tower, once proud, was now tilting slightly to the side, as if it were leaning toward the earth, tired of standing. The spire that had once been a beacon of faith seemed to have been swallowed by the mountain itself, its sharp silhouette lost against the oppressive sky. A strange mist swirled around the base of the church, clinging to the ground like something alive, writhing. Elias stepped out of the car, feeling the cold kiss of the air against his skin. He hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, he made his way toward the church. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and a rush of stale, musty air greeted him. Inside, the darkness felt thick, almost liquid, as though it were trying to pull him into its embrace. The church had been long abandoned, it seemed. The pews were covered in dust, the stone floor cracked in places, and the altar, once the focal point of reverent worship, now stood in solemn decay. The large wooden cross, which had once towered above the altar in a symbol of faith, had darkened with age, its grain now twisted and warped like the wood of an ancient tree. The silence inside was suffocating. As Father Elias walked further into the church, his footfalls echoed unnaturally, too loud, as if the building itself was stretching its time-worn bones to listen to him. The air was thick with the scent of decay, something that he couldn't quite place, a mix of old incense and something darker, something almost rotten. He made his way to the altar and kneeled, though the usual comfort of his rituals did not come. There was a gnawing sense of dread at the back of his mind, a sensation that the walls of the church were closing in around him, pushing him towards something, urging him to look deeper. As he sat there in silence, he noticed something odd. A faint scratching on the stone beneath the altar. It wasn't as though the sound had come from above or around him. It was something beneath him, from within the very bones of the church. He leaned down, trying to locate the source, and found a faint, barely legible inscription carved into the stone. The words were old, perhaps centuries old, their meaning faded by time. But the feeling it gave him was not of reverence. It was a warning, a curse. Those who seek the dead shall be made to walk among them. Elias recoiled. The words seemed to pulse, vibrating on the very stone, as if the church were alive and breathing with some malevolent presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls around him were shifting, watching, waiting for him to uncover something that had been buried long ago. The bell in the tower rang suddenly, its tolls deep and heavy, a thundering sound that shook the ground beneath him. The toll echoed through the village and beyond, sending a ripple of dread down his spine. It was a sound that did not belong. The bells in most churches rang with a certain clarity, a resonance that seemed to sing with the air. This bell, however, seemed to be trapped in the tower, its voice distorted, warped, as though it were trying to scream its own warning. Father Elias stood, his legs trembling, as if some ancient force had just reached out to touch him. He backed away from the altar, his heart hammering in his chest. The air had grown colder, denser, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, at the edge of the altar, beneath a pile of rotting cloth, was an object. It was too obscured by the shadow to be clear at first, but when he stepped closer, he saw it clearly. An old, decayed book. Its leather cover was cracked and dried, and it seemed as though it had been here for centuries. The pages were yellowed and torn, the binding falling apart. Yet the book felt alive, pulsing with an energy that made his skin prickle. Compelled by a force he could not understand, Elias reached down and picked it up. The instant his fingers touched the cover, a jolt of cold electricity shot through him, as if the book had been waiting for him. He turned it over, slowly, his hands shaking. The front cover bore a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle within a cross, a symbol far older than any he had encountered in his studies. The moment his fingers traced over it, he felt something stir within the church. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, swirling like smoke, and the temperature dropped even further. He could hear the faintest whispers now, voices like a distant wind, carried by the very walls. He who binds the dead will be bound in return. The whisper seemed to come from all around him. His body froze, his heart pounding in his chest, a sudden chill crawling beneath his skin. He knew, without a doubt, that something had been set into motion the moment his fingers touched that book. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into one voice, cold and ancient, one that seemed to pierce through the veil of time itself. "You have awoken us," it said, the voice rough, like the rasping of old bones. "Now, you must pay the price." Father Elias dropped the book, his breath quickening, panic rising in his throat. He stumbled backward, his feet catching on the floor, and as he turned to run, he felt the cold fingers of something unseen brush his back. The whispering voices followed him, growing louder, relentless, as if they were always behind him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Elias fled from the church, the door slamming behind him with a deafening bang. The village outside seemed eerily silent, its streets empty, as if it too had been waiting for him to leave the church. But deep within the darkness of the church, something stirred, something old and forgotten, awakening to the presence of a priest who would change everything. This expanded version offers a much deeper dive into Father Elias's internal struggles, the atmospheric horror of Ashdown, and his growing awareness of the ancient force at play. The mysterious book and the whispered warning create a sense of urgency, while the unsettling village atmosphere continues to build as an eerie backdrop to the unfolding mystery. The narrative will progress with these elements intensifying as Elias uncovers the truth of Ashdown's curse in later chapters. Chapter 2. The Eyes of the Past. Father Elias woke the next morning to the sound of birds outside his window, but even their chirping seemed muted by the oppressive fog that lingered around the village. It was as though the very air had thickened overnight, like a blanket of ash draped over the world. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, not sure whether to get up or remain hidden under the covers, in a futile attempt to escape the eerie reality of Ashdown. The events of the previous night, the strange book, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, still clung to him like a second skin, an invisible weight that pressed on his chest with every breath. The room itself was no sanctuary. It felt stale, its walls too close, too oppressive, like the inn was not just hosting him, but swallowing him into its folds. The window was cracked open, but no fresh air came through. Instead, there was only that heavy, almost suffocating stillness that seemed to characterize the village itself. He had never experienced anything like it before, not in the bustling streets of the city, not in the bustling noise of life that he had known. Ashdown felt like a place suspended in time, caught between the realms of the living and the dead. He sat up slowly, his eyes drawn to the strange painting hanging on the wall opposite his bed. The painting had been here for as long as the inn had been in business, the innkeeper had told him when they had greeted him last night. It was of a woman, pale and regal, standing by an overgrown well in the center of what seemed to be a forgotten graveyard. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight at him, and though he had tried to dismiss the feeling, there was something unnerving about the way her gaze followed him around the room. Shaking off the sensation, Elias rose, forcing himself to leave the warmth of the bed. The thick fog outside made everything look as though it was encased in glass, muted and distant. The town was still as silent as it had been the night before, but now there was a new weight to the quiet, something that made Elias want to turn back to the comfort of his room. But he had to get to the church. As he stepped out into the morning, the cold air bit at his skin, sharp as a blade. The road was empty, the only sound the shuffle of his footsteps against the gravel. The fog clung to the ground in thick, wavering sheets, curling around the edges of the buildings and swallowing the far end of the street. The church loomed ahead, its tall spire piercing the gloom like a needle in a vast, thick blanket. It had looked more foreboding in the distance, but now that he was closer, it felt more like an inevitable presence, something that had been here long before him and would remain long after. He walked up the steps, the heavy wooden door creaking as he pushed it open. The church was just as it had been last night, empty, silent, cold. The air inside was thick, but this time it didn't feel like the air of an abandoned building. It felt alive. There was a presence here, something that had been lingering for a long time. The faintest scent of incense mixed with something darker, more pungent, like the smell of rotting wood and damp earth. Father Elias's footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness of the church, a sound that was far too loud, far too hollow. His gaze drifted up to the altar, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye. It was fleeting, a mere shadow darting across the far wall. His heart skipped a beat, but when he turned his head to look, there was nothing there, only the cold stone walls, the empty pews, the faded tapestries hanging at odd angles. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. The church had an energy to it, a kind of thrum beneath the surface, as if it were pulsing with something long forgotten. He walked toward the altar, the feeling of eyes on him growing stronger with every step. The wooden cross at the center seemed to draw him in, its carved edges sharp and deep, its symbolism heavy with the weight of centuries of devotion. But the closer he got, the more the shadows in the room seemed to move with him, following him like dark, knowing eyes. He reached the altar, his fingers grazing the cold stone surface. There was nothing here, nothing except for a flicker of movement at the corner of his vision. Elias blinked, startled, and turned quickly. But once again, there was nothing there. But it didn't matter. He could feel it now. A presence lingering just beyond his perception. Something ancient. Something far older than the church itself. And then, in the silence, he heard it. Faint at first, like a whisper caught on the wind. It was a voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. "Leave now, priest." The words cut through the stillness like a blade, sending a chill down Elias's spine. He jerked back, eyes wide, heart thundering in his chest. His gaze shot to the shadows around him. But there was no one. No one in sight. The voice had been so clear, so real. And yet, the church was as empty as before. Elias shook his head, trying to calm the flutter of panic rising in his chest. "It's just the tension," he told himself. "This place has been abandoned for too long. I'm just not used to it." But deep down, he knew something was wrong. His unease hadn't come from the emptiness of the place, or even the whispering winds that seemed to rustle the curtains at the back of the church. No, it had come from the way the shadows had moved, just out of sight, just enough to make him question his senses. And the voice, "Leave now," felt like a warning, a command. But Elias wasn't one to back down. Not in the face of superstition, not in the face of his doubts. He had come here for a reason, and he wasn't about to leave without uncovering the truth. As he stepped back toward the altar, determined now, something caught his eye. There beneath the cloth, something shifted. A book, just like the one he had seen the night before. It was barely visible at first, half hidden beneath a tattered piece of fabric. The sight of it filled him with an odd sense of recognition. His pulse quickened. He bent down, his fingers brushing the fraying cloth, revealing the dark leather-bound book beneath. This time, as his hands made contact with the cover, he felt the jolt again. Stronger, sharper, like a shock of electricity running up his arm. The air around him seemed to contract, the temperature dropping several degrees in an instant. The church felt alive now, alive in a way that was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Elias pulled the book into his hands, his breath shallow. He held it for a moment, studying it. It was old, older than anything he had ever touched before. Its edges were frayed, its cover worn by time and neglect. But the symbol that adorned its front was unmistakable, a circle within a cross, a pattern that seemed to throb with dark energy. It was the same symbol he had seen in the painting at the inn, the woman standing by the well, her eyes fixed on him with such an intensity that it had unnerved him. This was no coincidence. The book wasn't just an artifact, it was a key to understanding what was happening in Ashdown. But as he opened the first page, a strange thing happened. The letters seemed to blur, as if they were shifting, rearranging themselves before his eyes. The text was in an ancient script, something foreign and incomprehensible, yet it felt familiar, as if he had seen it before, somewhere deep in his memory. The ones who walk in shadow shall bring forth the end. Elias's heart stopped, his eyes locked on the words, as if they were burning into his soul. He could hear the whispering voices again, closer this time, rising like a wave. The dead call to the living. The past will not remain silent. He slammed the book shut with a tremor in his hands. The air in the church thickened. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoed through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath his feet. Elias froze, every muscle in his body screaming to run. But the doors of the church slammed shut with a deafening crack, as though some unseen force had barricaded him inside. Something ancient was awakening in Ashdown, and it had set its sights on Father Elias. Chapter 3. The Watchers Beneath. Father Elias stood frozen before the desk, his pulse thundering in his ears as the weight of the book, its presence, pressed down on him. It had appeared again, the same book that had inexplicably moved itself into his study, but this time it was different. He could feel the heavy, suffocating aura of it, as if the very air in the room had thickened with an unseen force, the kind that chilled you from the inside out. His fingers hovered over the cover, trembling with indecision. The sense of dread that now filled the room was not new. It had been building ever since his arrival at the church. The strange events, the flickering lights, the whispers in the wind, all had led him to this moment. But the book had become something more. It was no longer just an object. It was a gateway, a portal to something ancient and malevolent. Elias exhaled shakily, summoning the strength to open the cover. The pages inside seemed to glimmer faintly in the low light, as if the very ink on them was alive, reacting to his presence. His eyes scanned the first few lines, the archaic script becoming clearer the longer he stared at it. The ritual is near. The watchers stir. They are always watching, always waiting. The dead call to the living, and the dead will return. He could not help but shiver at the words. The dead would return. Who were the watchers? What was this book trying to tell him? A sharp pain pierced his temple, as though a hidden hand had gripped his mind. He stumbled back a step, clutching his head. The whispers, the low murmurs that had been steadily rising in the background, grew louder now, coalescing into intelligible voices. Leave now. You are not meant to know. The dead. They are not at rest. Father Elias shut the book with a violent snap, his breath ragged. His body trembled uncontrollably, but his mind raced. The words haunted him, their implications crawling beneath his skin like insects. The dead. What did the book mean? Was it speaking of spirits? Of ghosts bound to the land by unfinished business? Or was it something worse? He could still feel the eerie presence in the room, like someone, was watching him from the corners, from beyond the walls. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, undulating ever so slightly as if alive. Elias's heart pounded harder as he instinctively turned toward the door, but before he could move, the air grew impossibly cold. The temperature in the room plummeted, and his breath began to fog in front of him, like the exhale of something living. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. A sudden creaking sound echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the faintest whisper, a sound barely perceptible, like a long, drawn-out sigh. Elias froze, his eyes darting toward the door. For a moment, he stood still, straining his senses. There it was again. A whisper. Low, guttural, almost imperceptible, like the wind brushing past his ear. Father. Elias. The voice was unmistakably human, but it sounded distant, disembodied, as though coming from a place that existed just beyond his reach, a place where the living could not go. He swallowed, his throat dry, and his pulse quickened. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling as he touched it. The cold burned his skin, and the moment his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was thick, too thick, and suffocating. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed from the other side of the door, causing Elias to stagger back. His heart lurched in his chest as the wood of the door rattled, a violent thudding sound reverberating through the walls. It wasn't someone knocking. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to break in, trying to reach him. Elias stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what this was. This wasn't a normal disturbance. This was a warning. A sudden coldness, like ice water running down his spine, seized him. The temperature had dropped so drastically that his teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. He shivered as he looked back toward the desk, his eyes immediately drawn to the open book. The book was calling to him. Leave now. You cannot fight what you cannot see. The voice seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls, swirling like a wind that refused to be ignored. Elias's thoughts became disjointed as the whispers overwhelmed his mind. The voices, though unintelligible at first, now had meaning, clashing fragments of conversation, desperate and pleading. And then, there it was, a flash of movement in the corner of his vision. Someone was there. He whipped his head around, heart racing. But there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching longer now, darker and deeper. You should not have come. The voice was unmistakable, clear this time. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the same one that had called his name. He turned slowly, his feet dragging as though he were wading through thick mud. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around him. The flickering candlelight cast long, grotesque shadows on the walls, contorting them into twisted shapes. He could feel eyes on him. No, he could feel something watching him, not just from one direction, but from every direction, from above, below, and all around. A presence, an ancient presence closing in on him. You should have left when you had the chance. The voice was louder now. It was no longer coming from the walls, but from within him. It was in his thoughts. It was in his very blood. Elias gasped for air, his vision swimming, his chest constricted as if the weight of 1,000 invisible hands were pressing down on him. He stumbled backward, his feet colliding with the chair. The book, it was the source of all of this. The source of the voices, of the unnatural cold, of the pressure building in his chest. Suddenly, the door slammed open with a violent force, sending him crashing into the chair behind him. The room filled with a loud, deafening silence, as though the world had stopped turning. In the doorway stood a figure, silhouetted against the dim light, its form impossibly tall and distorted, a shape that was both familiar and foreign, human and inhuman. It was him, but it wasn't. Father Elias stood frozen in shock. The figure in the doorway wore the same robes he had donned for years, but its movements were unnaturally fluid, too smooth, too predatory. Its face remained hidden beneath a hood, and though Elias could not see its eyes, he could feel them. The figure's presence seemed to reach into his very soul, twisting and turning him from within. The figure spoke again, its voice now unmistakably familiar, echoing in the hollow of Elias's skull. It is too late now, Father. You've already seen too much. The door slammed shut behind the figure with an unnatural finality. Elias was trapped. His body refused to move, his mind refusing to let him speak. The figure took a step forward, then another, and then, Father Elias. The voice that spoke his name now was not the same. It was not the voice of the figure before him. It was soft and breathless, a whisper that carried a weight of regret. And as Elias's eyes locked onto the figure's outstretched hand, he knew. The figure was not trying to hurt him. It was trying to warn him. But it was too late. Chapter 4. The Heart of the Abyss. Father Elias had not left the church since the night he first felt the weight of the book press into his hands, since the words inside began to crawl through his mind like slow-moving worms. The city around him seemed to fade away, its sounds dulled by the heavy fog that had descended on him both outside and in his soul. In the days that followed, time became a blur. The days stretched like slow, suffocating rivers, and the nights were fragments of fleeting terrors, terrifying visions, whispers in the dark, and the unrelenting pull of the book's presence. His body, though it still walked, felt like a vessel he no longer fully controlled. The pulse of his heartbeat reverberated in his skull, a constant thrum in the quiet moments. But there was no escape from it. Even as he tried to pray to find solace in the rituals he had spent his life performing, the words were no longer enough. The sanctuary he had once trusted, the church that had been his refuge, now seemed like a tomb, cold, oppressive, watching him, judging him. It was during one of these moments of empty silence that the voice came to him again. "You must descend." The voice was faint, barely audible, as if it emanated from the deepest recesses of his mind. It wasn't an external voice. It was inside him, growing, clawing for attention like something ancient and hungry. Elias knew what it meant. He had known, deep down, that the time had come. The crypt. He had to go there. He had always avoided it in the past. The crypt had been sealed for as long as he could remember, the key to its entrance long lost or hidden. But now, he could feel its presence, like a dark pulse in the bowels of the church, beating against the walls that had kept it locked away. And so, he stood at the edge of the church, the thick wooden doors creaking open with an unsettling sound as he stepped into the night. The wind, sharp and biting, caught his robes and made them flap against his legs as if trying to pull him back. But he ignored it. He had felt this before, the wind's warning, the pulling sensation that tugged at his very soul. But there was no turning back now. His feet carried him forward, down the narrow, twisting path that led to the church's rear, where the crypt stood like a silent sentinel. The door to the crypt had been sealed for centuries, or so the records said. The town elders had spoken of it, told stories about it, but no one had dared to open it. There had been rumors, of course, whispers among the old folk of voices heard from beneath the stone floors, of strange lights flickering from the cracks in the door, of shadows that moved unnaturally around the church in the dead of night. But they were just that, rumors. No one had ever truly believed it. Until now. Father Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the crypt's entrance. The door, a massive stone slab covered in ancient carvings, stood slightly ajar. Elias had not needed the key. The crypt had simply opened for him. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and there was an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath him. His fingers brushed against the stone door as he pushed it further open, the creak of the heavy stone door echoing through the silence like the groan of a dying animal. It was as if the crypt itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to enter. And enter he did, stepping over the threshold into the darkness beyond. Inside, the crypt was a place of cold stone and silence. A thick layer of dust coated the stone floor, and the air felt thick with the weight of time, ancient, oppressive, like the crypt had been forgotten by the world above. The walls were lined with sarcophagi, their surfaces carved with symbols and inscriptions Elias could not understand. Some of the carvings were familiar, Christian crosses and angels with downcast eyes. But there were others, darker symbols, that made his skin crawl. He shivered involuntarily, though he could not tell if it was from the chill in the air or from the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to settle over him like a heavy cloak. His breath came shallow, a steady stream of fog escaping from his lips into the frigid air. He had been in places like this before. Old cathedrals, abandoned chapels, crypts far older than this. But nothing had ever felt quite like this. The very air seemed to vibrate with an energy that made his nerves stand on end. The crypt was not just a tomb. It was a living thing. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were breathing with some unseen force. And in the far corner, Elias could just make out the faintest outline of something, or someone, moving in the shadows. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but Elias could feel it. He could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy upon him. "It's waiting for you." The voice, the one that had whispered to him for days, now grew louder, clearer, and it was no longer a figment of his imagination. It was real. Elias began to move deeper into the crypt, his every step echoing in the stillness. The silence here was suffocating, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. The shadows stretched unnaturally, curling around the sarcophagi as if alive, and every corner seemed to hide something just out of sight. The cold seemed to intensify the deeper he went, until it felt like his very bones were freezing. His body was no longer his own. His legs moved without his command. His hands trembled without reason. In the center of the crypt, the sarcophagi seemed to have been disturbed. Several of them had been opened, their lids cracked and broken, revealing empty spaces within. But the air around them was charged, as though someone, had recently risen from them. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he neared the farthest crypt, the one that had once belonged to the church's founder, Father Aldrich. Aldrich had been a man of great faith, or so the records said, but some of the older priests had whispered rumors about him, that he had dabbled in dark arts, that he had made pacts with forces beyond the light of God. No one had ever spoken of it aloud, but Elias had always wondered if there was truth behind the stories. Now, standing in front of Aldrich's open crypt, those whispers felt like they were alive. A cold gust of wind blew through the chamber, extinguishing the candles one by one. The air grew thick, stifling, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. Elias stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. The whispering was louder now, more urgent, and it felt like the walls were closing in on him. The crypt was alive with something ancient, something malevolent. "We are here. You are ours." A sudden crash echoed through the crypt, as if something heavy had fallen. Elias spun around, his heart racing. From the shadows, the figure emerged once again. This time, it was not just one shadow, but many, countless shapes, moving as if they were bound together by some unseen force. They were silent, but their presence filled the crypt with an unmistakable dread. The first figure stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body thin and elongated, its face hidden in shadow. The only feature Elias could make out were its eyes, pale, milky white eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "You should have never come here," the figure whispered, its voice a low rasp that seemed to scrape against Elias's mind. "This place is cursed, and now you are one with it." The air crackled with energy, and Elias felt someone, gripping his very soul. He tried to turn, to flee, but his legs refused to move. His body was rooted to the spot, held captive by the unseen force. There is no escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet cracked open, splitting with a deafening roar. The stone floor shattered, revealing a yawning chasm of darkness beneath. A cold, suffocating wind rushed up from the abyss, pulling at Elias's robes, tugging at his very soul. His heart hammered in his chest as he felt himself falling into the void. His limbs jerked in panic, but they were no longer his to command. The shadows swirled around him, tightening their grip, pulling him down into the blackness below. And just before he lost all sense of time and space, just before the darkness consumed him completely, he heard it, the voice. "You belong to us now." Chapter 5. The Binding Whisper, Extended. Father Elias awoke to the sound of his own breath, shallow, labored, and uneven, as though the very act of drawing air had become an effort. He felt the cold, damp sheets tangled around his legs, their chill seeping into his skin like the breath of death itself. The room was dark, save for the faint slivers of moonlight that crept through the heavy curtains, casting long, pale fingers across the worn wooden floorboards. For a moment, he lay still, as though waiting for something, anything, that would tell him this was all a nightmare. A fevered dream, the product of too many late nights spent in the crypt beneath the church, poring over ancient texts whose ink seemed to have a life of its own, whispering truths that should never be uncovered. But as his senses slowly returned to him, the unmistakable weight of dread settled heavily on his chest. There was something in the air, a presence. It was faint at first, just a tickle at the back of his neck, a sensation, like a cold wind brushing against his skin, but not quite reaching it, the kind of wind that made the hairs on your arms stand on end. Elias's eyes darted to the corner of the room instinctively, even though he knew there was nothing there. The darkness felt alive, as if it had begun to swell, to breathe, alongside him. He pushed himself upright, the bed creaking under his weight, and rubbed his eyes with his palms. He had no memory of falling asleep. Had he been meditating again? Or had he fallen into an uneasy slumber after another long night of studying the cursed book, the one that called to him with its seductive whispers? The strange sensation still lingered. The whispers. They were distant, muffled beneath the layers of his thoughts, but unmistakable. Voices, murmuring at the edges of his consciousness, their words too faint to understand. He could feel them pressing against the walls of his mind, like something desperately trying to get in, trying to make him listen. "Come to the altar," they whispered, a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The time is near, the prophecy is unfolding. You will be the last one to serve." Elias froze, the words sinking into his mind like a poison. He had heard these voices before. They had spoken to him the night he found the book in the hidden chamber beneath the church. They had promised him power, eternal life, an end to the endless suffering of the world. But there had been a price he hadn't yet fully understood. And now, they were calling to him again. His heart thudded in his chest, and he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The book had marked him. It had chosen him. He had already accepted its call by taking it into his hands, by opening its ancient pages and deciphering its forbidden language. There was no going back. The whispers grew louder now, more insistent, their voices overlapping, filling the room, suffocating him. "You are the last one, the last to fulfill the prophecy, the last to bind the dead." The words circled him, pressing down like a physical weight, as if they were closing in on him, tightening their grip with every passing moment. He could feel their breath on his skin, like a cold wind, but it wasn't the chill of the night air. No, this was something far worse. Something that came from deep within the earth itself, from a place that no living being should ever reach. "You are chosen, Father Elias. You are the vessel for the final sacrifice." His head swam, his vision blurring. He stumbled out of the bed, his legs unsteady beneath him, and made his way toward the window. He needed air. He needed to see the outside world, to remind himself that there was still something normal left in his life. Something real. But as he pulled open the curtains and gazed out into the darkened street below, he saw only darkness. The world had grown still, almost eerily so. The moonlight painted the buildings in a cold, unfeeling light. Not a single figure moved in the street. There were no sounds, no crickets, no distant murmurs of life. It was as though the entire town had been swallowed by an abyss, leaving behind only the echo of silence. And then he saw it. At the far end of the street, just beneath the shadow of the old church bell tower, there was a figure standing motionless. A figure that seemed to shimmer in the darkness, barely distinguishable from the shadows. It stood perfectly still, but Elias could feel its presence. It was waiting for him, calling to him. "Come!" The whisper came again, louder now, clear and insistent. "Come to us, Father Elias. Come to the altar." He recoiled, his breath coming faster, his pulse hammering in his throat. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few moments. The air grew thick around him, suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in on him. With trembling hands, he closed the curtains and backed away from the window. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of this house, away from the church, away from the curse that had taken hold of him. He couldn't, no, he mustn't, go back to that altar. He couldn't allow himself to be consumed by the darkness. But even as he thought this, he knew it was already too late. The whispers didn't stop. They were inside him now, like a persistent ache in the back of his mind, a constant gnawing at his sanity. He could feel their pull, their compulsion, dragging him back to the very place he had sworn to avoid. The book, the altar, the dead. "You are marked, Father Elias. You have already taken the first step." His breath hitched in his throat as he remembered the words of the old priest, the one who had warned him of the power contained within the ancient tome, the one who had spoken of the binding ritual and the final sacrifice. He had begged Elias to leave the church, to run from the curse that had followed the book for centuries. But Elias had been too proud, too desperate to prove himself worthy of the title of priest. He had refused, and now the price was being demanded. He looked around the room, his eyes falling on the small wooden desk where the book rested. It was still there, lying open, its pages yellowed with age, but the words on the pages now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The book was alive. It was waiting. Elias had no choice. He had to go back to the altar. The whispers wouldn't stop until he did. There was no escaping them. With a final shaky breath, Elias turned and walked toward the door, the echoes of his footsteps seeming louder than usual in the stillness of the church. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the very building was holding its breath, waiting for the moment he would cross the threshold. As he made his way down the long, dark corridors of the church, every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of wood seemed to carry a deeper meaning. The walls closed in around him, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, and all the while, the whispers never stopped, swirling around him like an unseen wind, pulling him closer to the altar, to the inevitable. He reached the doors of the sanctuary. The heavy wooden doors loomed before him, the dark carved symbols on their surface almost seeming to move, shifting like the faces of the damned. He pushed them open, the sound of the hinges screeching in the stillness, and stepped into the church. The altar was in the center of the room, bathed in a cold, unnatural light. The candles on the altar flickered and danced, their flames casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like serpents. And there, in the center of the altar, was the book. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, like 1,000 voices crying out in desperation. Elias could feel their presence, their cold fingers reaching out to touch him, to pull him into the darkness. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The book seemed to beckon to him, its pages turning on their own, as though eager for him to continue. "Come, Father Elias, the ritual begins." And with that, he stepped closer, his hands trembling as they reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed the pages, a wave of cold surged through him, as though he had plunged into an ice-cold lake. His body went rigid, his mind screaming in terror as the whispers filled him completely, drowning out everything else. It is too late. The ritual had begun. This extended version of Chapter 5 further builds the tension, adding more atmospheric details to heighten the suspense and psychological dread. The descriptions of the church, Elias's state of mind, and the growing sense of doom intensify, leading up to the inevitable moment when he succumbs to the curse. Would you like me to continue with the next chapters, or adjust any specific parts? Chapter 6. The Echoes of the Damned. The air in the church was thick, oppressive. A suffocating silence clung to the stone walls like a shroud. Father Elias stood at the altar, his fingers still trembling as they grazed the pages of the ancient book. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear, a cacophony of voices drowning out his own thoughts. It was as if the church itself had begun to speak to him. Every crack in the walls, every shadow cast by the flickering candlelight, seemed to carry a message, a warning. "It is too late, Father Elias. You have awakened us." The words seemed to pulse with a strange, vibrating energy. His hands, now pressed firmly against the tome, felt as though they were not his own. They burned with a cold, inhuman intensity, like they were being pulled toward the book, drawn by an invisible force. He had thought the worst of the ritual was behind him, that simply opening the book had been the act that tied him to this curse. But now, as the pages turned on their own, each one whispering secrets of the damned, he realized the true horror of what he had done. This was not merely about the book, it was about him. Father Elias's head was swimming. He could feel his sanity unraveling, the thin threads of his mind beginning to fray under the weight of the book's presence. The room around him seemed to bend and distort, the flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. His vision blurred and he staggered, one hand bracing against the altar, the other clutching the cursed book. "We have been waiting for you, Father Elias," the whispers said again. "You are the last, the final one to bear the burden." His heart raced, pounding in his chest, as a chill so deep it seemed to freeze the marrow in his bones washed over him. It was the cold of death, It was the cold of the grave, and it was coming for him. He looked down at the book, the pages fluttering rapidly as if in a frenzy. The words on the parchment blurred and merged, until they seemed to dissolve into the very air around him, a fog of darkness that threatened to consume him. There was no escape from this place. The whispers had become a chorus, an unholy congregation, and they were all speaking his name. Father Elias, Father Elias. It was his name, but it sounded distant, hollow, as though it were not his own, as though it belonged to something else, something darker, older, that had long since ceased to be human. A cold hand, icy and unfeeling, gripped his heart. He gasped, his breath shallow and erratic, as the sensation of being watched overcame him. He wasn't alone. He knew he wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room stirred, coiling and shifting with a life of their own. Figures, dark, indistinct, like wisps of smoke, emerged from the edges of his vision. At first, he thought they were simply tricks of the light, but then they began to take shape. Elias recoiled, his back pressing hard against the cold stone of the altar. His pulse quickened. The figures, they were real, their shapes blurred in and out of existence, like mirages fading in the wind. There were no faces, no features, only darkness. But Elias could feel them watching him, waiting. They are coming for you, Father Elias. The past is alive again. The words reverberated in his mind, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier. It felt as though the walls of the church were closing in, the very ground beneath his feet buckling, folding in on itself. He looked down at the altar. The book had stopped turning. It was now open to a page that seemed to bleed into the air itself. A grotesque, unreadable script, but one that carried with it a weight of ancient evil. There was no mistaking it. The page was a call, a summons, and he, Father Elias, was the one being summoned. The whispers intensified, not just in his mind now, but all around him. They were coming from every direction, from the very walls, from the floor beneath his feet, from the ceiling above. The church was alive with sound, 1,000 voices murmuring, moaning, whispering, each one a reflection of something that should not be. Father Elias, come to us, come to your destiny. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Elias could taste it on his tongue, rotting flesh, ancient earth, the stench of things long buried. The very foundation of the church seemed to shift beneath him, like the ground was slowly giving way. The altar groaned under his hands, the wood splintering with an unnatural force. A low, deep rumble shook the floor beneath his feet, a tremor so powerful it nearly sent him to his knees. He staggered backward, the book slipping from his grasp. He watched, horrified, as the book hovered in midair for a brief moment, its pages flicking wildly, then dropped to the ground with a deafening crash. It landed with a soft thud, but the sound echoed through the church, like the last breath of something dying. A shadow moved across the altar. For a split second, Elias thought he saw something. A figure, long and twisted, emerging from the darkness, its shape moving, undulating, as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. But when he blinked, it was gone. His breath hitched. He had seen it. He had seen it. And now he was certain. The church was no longer a place of sanctuary. It had become a gateway, a door to something much darker than anything he had ever imagined. Father Elias backed away from the altar, his heart hammering in his chest, but his feet were heavy. He could not leave. He knew this now. There was no escape. The whispers, the shadows, the figures, they had all come for him. They had always been here, waiting for the moment when he would finally open the book. Come closer, Father Elias. The voice came again, but now it was different. Closer, more tangible. It was not coming from the air around him, but from within him, like the words were carved into his very soul. He could not ignore it anymore. He had no choice. With trembling hands, he reached forward, his fingers brushing the edges of the book. The moment his skin made contact, the entire church seemed to shake. The floor beneath him cracked open with a horrible sound, and a blinding light erupted from the book, engulfing him in a storm of light and shadow. The shadows that had once clung to the edges of the room, those restless, shifting forms, now surged forward. They were no longer mere figures, but full-blown manifestations, their shapes twisting and contorting as they reached for him. Their hands were skeletal, their faces hollow and pale. Some had eyes, empty black pits, while others were nothing but the void itself, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers turned into shrill, agonized wails as the figures surrounded him. Father Elias tried to scream, to break free, but the darkness had already consumed him. There was no light, no sound, no hope, only the terrible, suffocating presence of the damned. And then, all at once, it stopped. The shadows vanished, the wails fell silent, and the church was still again. But Elias did not feel relief. No. He felt something worse. Something he could not put into words. "You have fulfilled your part," the voice intoned, low and final. It was not a whisper anymore. It was a command. The last one is here. The sacrifice has been made. Father Elias collapsed to his knees, his mind a whirl of fragments, his body trembling violently. The shadows had not left. They were still there, deep inside him now, pulsing in his veins, whispering their truths. He had no choice now. He was their servant, and the price of his soul had been paid. Chapter 7. The hollow path expanded. The church stood silent under the oppressive cloak of night, a hollow monument to something forgotten. The moon in its eternal vigilance cast pale light through the broken windows, but it did little to stave off the suffocating darkness that filled the space. The cold air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew, dust, and a faint, almost imperceptible odor of decay, like the remnants of something that had once been alive, but now was merely a shadow of its former self. Father Elias could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him from the corners of the crumbling walls. The candle flames that had once illuminated the altar flickered weakly, as though uncertain whether they should continue to burn in the presence of the growing darkness. The shadows themselves seemed to be alive, moving with a kind of slow, deliberate hunger, creeping toward him from all sides, their whispers rising in pitch with every passing second. Elias stood frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The book lay before him, its pages cracked and yellowed, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. He couldn't take his eyes off it. The words seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, entwining his mind with their dread. The silence was shattered by the sound of something scraping against the stone floor. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he turned slowly, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. A figure stepped out from the shadows at the far end of the church, moving slowly, deliberately. It was tall, far too tall, and impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, too long for the body they belonged to. The creature's silhouette was nothing more than a distortion in the darkness, a shape that seemed to flicker and twist, as though it was not entirely a part of the world it inhabited. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the figure emerged from the darkened corners, its presence filling the space, pushing the light away. Every step it took was accompanied by a soft, sickening sound, the dragging of something wet, something that should not be dragging, like flesh scraping against stone. And then it stopped, standing just a few feet from him, its empty gaze fixed upon him. The air around Elias seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, suffocating him. His throat tightened as he fought to breathe, but the air had turned stale, heavy, as if the very essence of life had been drained from it. The figure's form shimmered, flickering like a candle in the wind, its features distorting and twisting in a grotesque dance. The emptiness of its face seemed to consume the light, swallowing it whole. No eyes, no mouth, just a featureless void, a pit that stretched into infinity, threatening to pull Elias in, to swallow him whole. The whispers began again, this time louder, more insistent, rising from the darkness, from the cracks in the walls, from the very ground beneath his feet. The voices were not human. They were ancient. They were primordial. They spoke in a language that Elias could not understand, but they didn't need to be understood. He felt them, deep inside his chest, each word a pulse, each syllable a knife driving deeper into his mind. "You have called us," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping hiss, as though it were speaking through the cracks of a tomb. The sound wasn't simply heard. It felt like it was crawling inside him, twisting his organs, digging into the very core of his being. "You have opened the door." The ground trembled beneath him, and for the briefest moment, Elias thought he could hear something beneath it. A low rumble, like the growl of an ancient beast, stirring from a deep slumber. He staggered back, his legs giving way beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his hands trembling as they scraped against the rough surface. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost, choked in his throat, swallowed by the darkness that had already claimed him. The figure took a step closer, its long skeletal hand reaching out, its fingers stretching toward him. Like tendrils of some unnatural growth, the coldness emanating from it was unbearable, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Elias felt his breath freeze in his lungs. He wanted to move. He needed to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him had solidified, pinning him to the ground, preventing any movement. The shadows pressed against him from all sides, closing in tighter, darker, more suffocating. "You have unlocked what should have remained sealed," the figure continued, its voice growing more distinct, more real. "And now the price will be paid." Elias could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the sound of it deafening in the oppressive silence. His mind was racing, thoughts colliding with each other in a chaotic mess. He tried to remember the teachings, the prayers he had once held dear, but they seemed so far away now, so irrelevant, as if they had never been a part of him at all. All he could think about was the curse, the power he had invoked. The world had become unmoored from its foundations, and everything around him was folding, bending, crumbling under the weight of what he had done. The figure's voice lowered to a rasp, its breath a cold wind that swept across Elias's face. "Your soul is bound to this place now. You will walk the hollow path for eternity." Elias's eyes widened in horror as he realized the truth. He had done more than summon something ancient and malevolent into the world. He had become a part of it. His soul was now tethered to this forsaken church, to the ruins of the past, and there was no escape. Not now, not ever. The ground beneath him began to tremble again, this time more violently. The stones cracked, and a deep, guttural sound filled the air. A sound like something ancient, something alive, awakening from its slumber. The figure's form began to shift and distort, its body flickering, its movements jerky and unnatural. Elias could see the darkness pouring out of it now, like a black liquid, oozing from its very skin, filling the space around him, crawling across the walls, across the ceiling. He could hear the sounds now. Screams, wailing, moaning, the cries of the damned, the souls of the lost, trapped in this place, trapped in this eternal cycle of suffering. And they were coming for him. They were reaching out to him from the darkness, their hands clawing at the edges of his sanity, tearing at the fabric of his mind. The book lay open before him, its pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen wind. But it was not wind. It was the breath of something far darker, something far more ancient. The air around him seemed to pulse, as if the world itself were alive, as if the very fabric of reality was bending and breaking under the weight of the curse. Elias reached out toward the book, his hand trembling uncontrollably. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. He could no longer tell where the voices ended and his own thoughts began. The words on the pages seemed to glow now, their ink alive with power, with malice. He had to finish it. He had to end it. There was no other way. He closed his eyes and began to chant, the words of the incantation coming to him as if they had always been a part of him, buried deep within his soul. He felt the power coursing through him, the darkness wrapping around him like a vice. And for a brief moment, he thought he could see something, the faintest outline of a figure, standing at the far end of the church, watching him with eyes that were full of nothing but hunger. And then everything went black. Chapter 8. The hollowed echoes expanded. Father Elias sat motionless on the cold stone floor of the church, his hands trembling as they rested against the weathered pages of the black codex. The silence around him was oppressive, unnatural. Even the faint rustle of the wind outside the broken windows had ceased. It was as though the world itself had been held in breathless anticipation, waiting for something to happen. Something that had already been set in motion long before he had arrived. His mind was still reeling from the horrors he had uncovered in the ancient text. The rituals, the incantations, the names, the symbols, the blood, all of it had led him here, to this moment, this very place, a place that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. He could feel the weight of the church pressing down on him. The stone walls that once offered solace now seemed to close in with each passing second, their coldness seeping into his bones, chilling him to the marrow. The once holy place had become a vessel for something else, a dark, ancient force that was neither human nor divine. The shadows clung to the edges of his vision, shifting like living things, watching him with hungry eyes. He had awakened something, and now there was no escaping it. He had opened the door to the unknown, and he was the one who would pay the price. The altar before him loomed like an ominous monolith, its surface streaked with dark stains. Old blood, perhaps, or something worse. The air around it hummed with an eerie vibration, a low, almost imperceptible pulse that seemed to resonate deep within his chest. His gaze flicked to the cracked stained glass windows, the shattered pieces reflecting twisted, distorted images of the outside world, a world that seemed to have no place here anymore. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but inside, the church was deathly still. A silence that was suffocating, like a thick fog that had settled over the very air. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the dusty pages of the codex. The words on the parchment blurred before his eyes, their meaning slipping through his fingers like water. Yet he could not look away. He had to find it. He had to find the answer, the way to undo the damage he had caused. Sacrifice. The word appeared before him again, etched into his mind as though it had been branded into his very soul. Sacrifice. It was the answer, the only way to close the door, to stop the horrors that were now encroaching upon him. But the price was beyond anything he had imagined. The codex spoke of a soul, his soul. To sever the link between this world and the realm beyond, he would have to give up everything. His very essence would be forfeit, consumed by the darkness he had unleashed. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to close the book, to cast it aside, to tear it into 1,000 pieces and burn it to ash. But he could not. The knowledge had already taken root. It had already infected him. He could feel it deep within his mind, that whispering, insistent voice that urged him forward, urging him to finish what had been started. The ground beneath him trembled, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The stones of the church groaned, as though the very foundations were shifting. The air grew colder, a biting chill that sunk into his skin, into his very soul. He stood up shakily, feeling the weight of the room pressing against him. The shadows were gathering now, thickening like a fog that had risen from the depths of the earth, coiling around him, consuming the space between him and the altar. It was then that he heard it, the faintest sound, a whisper that came from the darkness. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps his own mind playing tricks on him. But then the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was a voice. It was calling to him. Elias? The voice was low and guttural, a rasping sound that slid into his mind like a poison. It felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for centuries, waiting for the moment when he would be ready to hear it. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a growing unease, a gnawing sense of dread that began to spread throughout his entire body. His limbs were heavy, his heart racing as he turned toward the altar, unable to tear his eyes away from the source of the voice. Come to us. It was a command now, no longer a whisper. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, vibrating in the air. The shadows stretched and twisted, coiling around the stone pillars like serpents. He could see them now. Dark shapes, silhouettes that moved in the periphery of his vision, just beyond the light of the candles. They were getting closer, inching toward him like hungry beasts, their movements slow and deliberate. The church seemed to shift, to breathe, as though it were alive. Elias felt it, a presence, an energy, swirling in the air around him, pressing against his skin. The darkness was not just around him now, it was inside him. His breath became shallow, his pulse quickened, but he could not move. The shadows were tightening their grip on him, pulling him into their web. His legs felt like lead, his arms heavy and unresponsive. And then, there they were, the figures. They stepped into the dim light, their faces hidden in the shadows, but their presence undeniable. Their bodies were tall, impossibly thin. Their limbs stretched beyond human proportions. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, were nothing more than voids, empty, infinite darkness where a soul should have been. They were the lost ones, the forgotten ones, the dead. Elias froze, his body refusing to obey him. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, but his limbs were paralyzed, as though his very will had been stripped away, leaving him an empty vessel for whatever horror this place had conjured. His breath caught in his throat as he saw their mouths open, wide, far too wide, their lips peeling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Teeth that dripped with something black, something thick and foul, as they whispered their invitation. Come closer. Elias felt his legs move of their own accord, slowly, unwillingly, toward the altar. The shadows wrapped around him like tendrils, urging him forward, suffocating him with their darkness. His vision blurred again, the edges of the room distorting, and for a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, a shape in the far corner of the church. It was tall, its head nearly scraping the rafters above, its body cloaked in a shroud of darkness. And in its hands, it held something. A book. The codex. But how? He had left it on the altar. It had been here. His heart thudded in his chest as he reached for it. The figure, the thing, watched him with its unblinking empty eyes. He could feel its gaze, pressing into him, crushing him. The air seemed to grow colder still, colder than death itself. His hands trembled as he reached out, the pages of the codex fluttering in the breeze that did not exist. He opened it, and the words, those words, spoke to him once more, burning into his mind. To sever the link, you must give yourself completely. Your soul is forfeit, your essence will be consumed. The shadows writhed, the whispers growing louder. The church was no longer just a building, it was a mouth, a maw, and Elias was the offering. He couldn't think anymore. His mind was a blur, a swirl of thoughts and images. His body moved against his will, stumbling toward the altar, drawn to it like a moth to a flame, and then he understood. He was not the one who would close the door. He was the one who would open it. He was the one who would give it all. Sacrifice. The word reverberated in his skull, louder than the whispers, more insistent than the howling wind. It was a command, his soul, his life, his existence. As he reached the altar, the shadows surged forward, coiling around him, sinking into his skin, into his veins. His mouth opened, but no sound escaped. His body was no longer his own. It belonged to them now. And then, in the deepest, darkest corner of his mind, Elias knew he was already dead. Chapter 9. The Price of Oblivion. Extended version. The church, once a beacon of sanctuary, now stood as a hollow monument to sin and despair. A place of refuge, now forsaken and decayed, its once pristine pews covered in a blanket of dust, the air stagnant with the stench of forgotten prayers. Father Elias had spent hours within these walls, poring over the codex, deciphering its cursed text, believing that knowledge, true, ancient knowledge, was the key to salvation. But the deeper he delved into its pages, the more he understood that salvation was a lie. The air felt thicker now, heavier, almost suffocating. Each breath he took tasted of mildew and dust, a far cry from the sanctity it once promised. The stained glass windows, those intricate mosaics depicting the lives of saints, had been shattered long ago, leaving jagged remnants of glass scattered like broken dreams across the floor. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a mournful wail that sounded like the souls of the damned calling to him, pleading for release. He stood alone at the altar, the codex gripped tightly in his hands. The pages seemed to pulse under his fingertips, the ink shifting, as though the book itself were alive, watching, waiting. He could feel the weight of its malevolent power pressing against his chest, the knowledge it contained clawing at the edges of his sanity. He had read its warnings. each one more cryptic and ominous than the last. But Father Elias was not a man easily deterred by warnings. He had sought this knowledge out. He had needed it. As the final bell had tolled hours ago, he knew the time was coming. The ritual could not be undone now. It had already begun. The ground trembled slightly, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the church. Father Elias's heart skipped a beat. Was it an earthquake? Or was it something more? The darkness within these walls was ancient, far older than any earthquake, any storm. He could feel it now, creeping up from beneath the floorboards, rising like a tide. They are coming. He had heard the whispers, soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but now they were louder, more insistent, their words clearer, sharper. The dead were coming, their voices seeping through the cracks in the church, clawing at the edges of his mind. They were angry, they were hungry, and Elias, in his arrogance, had unknowingly become their feast. The codex began to hum in his hands, the pages flipping on their own. Guided by a force that was not his own, Elias closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath. He had known this was coming. He had known it since the moment he first opened the book and allowed its darkness to pour into his soul. But even knowing the cost, he had pressed on. The knowledge it offered, the power it promised, had been too great a temptation for him to resist. When he opened his eyes, the church had changed. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The pews now twisted and contorted, their once polished wood warped and gnarled like the roots of some ancient tree. The altar, too, had shifted. It seemed to rise, becoming taller, more imposing, its stone surface slick with something Elias could not identify. His mind began to unravel, the threads of his thoughts breaking apart as the whispers grew louder. You cannot undo what has been done. The voice came from the shadows, and for a moment, Elias thought it was his own mind, playing tricks on him. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the altar. A woman, tall and thin, her hair black as pitch, hanging in wild tangles around her face. Her eyes were hollow, deep pits of darkness, and as she stepped forward, Elias felt the air grow colder. The temperature in the room plummeted, and his breath came in visible bursts, the icy air stinging his lungs. He knew her immediately, though he had never seen her face before. She was the one the book had warned him about, the one who had been waiting. She was the price of his ignorance. "You have come far, Father Elias," she said, her voice a soft whisper, though it echoed through the church like a thunderclap. Too far. Elias staggered back, his hands trembling as he held the codex close to his chest, as if it might protect him. But it was no use. The power of the book had already consumed him, and there was no turning back. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder of his impending doom. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile at all. It was a grimace, a rictus of death. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, locked onto his, and Elias felt his legs weaken beneath him. He wanted to flee, to run from this nightmare, but his body refused to move. "I am what you sought, Father." Her voice was gentle, but there was an underlying malice that made his skin crawl. "I am the answer to your prayers, the one you called forth." Her words sent a chill down Elias's spine, and he could feel the ground beneath him trembling once more, as though the earth itself were rebelling against her presence. The whispers grew louder, like the howling wind outside, filling his ears with their maddening chorus. "You opened the codex," the woman continued, her voice low, like the wind sweeping through a graveyard. "You called us, you invited us into your world. And now—" She trailed off, and Elias's heart stopped for a moment. He could hear it now, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, but then growing louder, more distinct. It was the sound of thousands of voices, echoing through the church, the voices of the dead, the forgotten souls who had been condemned to wander the earth, denied rest, denied peace. And now they had come for him. "Now you will pay the price." Her voice was no longer a whisper, but a scream, the sound echoing through the walls of the church, reverberating through his skull. Elias fell to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. The codex slipped from his hands, its pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen wind. The shadows in the church seemed to grow darker, stretching out like tendrils of smoke, wrapping around him, suffocating him. "The dead will never rest, Father," the woman said, her voice like a knife slicing through his soul. "They never forget." And then the shadows came alive. They moved in the corners of his vision, undulating and writhing like something corporeal, something alive. The dead had come, their restless souls seeking vengeance. Elias could feel them closing in, their cold hands reaching for him, their hollow eyes burning with hatred and despair. He could hear their whispers, their cries, their pleas for justice. "You will join us, Father. You will never leave." The walls of the church began to close in around him, and Elias could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on him. The woman stepped closer, her form shifting and warping, her face contorting into something monstrous, her body elongated, stretching impossibly, as though her very being was being pulled apart by the forces that inhabited this place. "No, please!" Elias gasped, his voice barely a whisper as he looked up at her, but there was no mercy in her eyes, no pity. There was only the cold emptiness of the grave. She was the price he had paid for his curiosity, for his hunger for knowledge, and now the dead were here to collect. The darkness around him deepened, swallowing him whole. The whispers grew louder, and he could feel them, all of them, thousands of souls, their voices merging into one, an unholy chorus that rattled his bones. "You sought power," the woman hissed, her voice now a guttural growl. "And now you will be one of us." With one final heart-stopping scream, Father Elias was engulfed by the darkness. The dead had claimed him. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Legacy. The storm had finally begun to subside, but the air was still thick with an unsettling heaviness. Ethan stood at the edge of the mansion, watching the last of the rain drip from the overhanging eaves, pooling into dark puddles at his feet. The distant rumble of thunder echoed faintly in the valley, and the house loomed behind him like a silent sentinel, its windows now dark and unyielding. The violent storm, which had raged through the night, was a reflection of the chaos that had consumed them all. But now, with the end in sight, there was only the silence of the aftermath. Ethan felt as though he were walking through a dream, a waking nightmare. His body was still trembling from the violence of the past hours, yet he was numb. Numb to the loss, to the guilt, and to the weight of the decisions he had made. Everything had come to this. Everything had led him here. To the last moment of the Strathmore legacy, to the final confrontation that would seal their fate. But how much of it had been his own doing, and how much had been the work of the dead? He wasn't sure anymore. He had broken the cycle, yes, but at what cost? The mansion had been reduced to rubble, the spirits of the dead finally at peace, their voices no longer crying in the night. And yet, Ethan knew that peace came at a price that even the dead couldn't have anticipated. Victoria Strathmore was gone, her soul seemingly extinguished with the storm. But Ethan couldn't shake the image of her face from his mind. The last words she had whispered to him before her disappearance echoed endlessly in his thoughts. "You think you've won, but nothing ends here. The dead do not forget, and neither do I. The Strathmore legacy will live on." He had ignored her, thinking her words were nothing more than a bitter echo of a dying soul. But as the dawn light broke through the clouds, bathing the wreckage in an eerie golden glow, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching him from the shadows. And somewhere in that shadow, he knew he was not free. Ethan took a deep breath and began to walk back toward the ruins of the mansion, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The wind whispered through the broken windows and cracks in the stone, carrying with it a sound that almost resembled laughter, low, soft, and haunting. It was as though the house itself had not yet accepted its end, and perhaps it never would. He reached the base of the grand staircase, now little more than a pile of rubble and dust. The remnants of the ritual that had claimed so many lives still hung in the air, like a faint perfume of decay. His mind replayed the events of the night, the rituals, the betrayals, the promises made by those who had come before him. The Strathmores had lived on the edge of death for generations, using the dead to fuel their power. But what was power when you were bound to the very thing you sought to control? He glanced down at his hands, stained with the remnants of his struggle. Blood, both his own and others, had seeped into his skin, forever marking him. He had once sought to understand the Strathmore legacy, to understand the mysterious practices of the family and the dark rituals they had performed. Now, he understood all too well. The legacy wasn't just about wealth or power, it was about control. And when you tried to control the dead, when you tried to force them into your service, they didn't simply obey. They took from you, they twisted you into something else, something unrecognizable. Ethan shuddered and turned away from the ruins of the house. It was over now. The mansion was gone and the Strathmore family had vanished with it. There would be no more claims, no more sacrifices. But in the deepest part of his soul, he knew that the darkness had not truly been vanquished. It had only been postponed. He made his way through the wreckage to the small grove of trees at the edge of the property. The ground here was soft, disturbed by the remnants of the storm, but Ethan felt a strange compulsion to walk through it, as if the earth itself was calling to him. He knelt beside a patch of broken earth where the remnants of a tombstone had once stood. It was here, in this spot, that the ritual had begun. It was here that the last of the Strathmores had made their pact with the dead. He reached out and brushed his fingers over the earth, feeling the coldness of it seep into his skin. The silence of the morning was oppressive, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of the past pressing against him, suffocating him. The Strathmore legacy was not something that could be erased. It had burrowed deep into the land, into the very bones of the earth, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how many miles he put between himself and the ruins of the mansion, he would never be free of it. A sudden gust of wind stirred the trees, and the faintest sound, like the rustling of paper, reached Ethan's ears. He stood up quickly, heart racing. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, feel the presence of something unseen. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his pulse quickened. "Ethan," a voice whispered, a voice that seemed to come from all around him. It was familiar, yet foreign, cold, yet burning. He spun around, but there was no one there. "Ethan, you don't think you've escaped, do you?" The voice was louder now, more insistent, wrapping around him like a shroud. It was unmistakable. Victoria. Her voice. She was here, still reaching out, even after death. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But the voice, the presence, it was undeniable. "You can't escape the Strathmores. We are forever bound to the dead." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted around, looking for any sign of life. There was nothing. The land was still, the trees silent. And yet, he felt her gaze on him, watching him from the darkness. The wind died down, and for a moment, there was only the faint rustling of leaves. Then, in a quiet voice, Victoria spoke again. "You were never meant to break the cycle. You should have known that. There is no freedom for those who choose to defy us. You've only made the darkness stronger." Ethan closed his eyes, his hands shaking. The words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. It was true. He had tried to escape, but there was no escape from the Strathmores, no escape from the dead. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the earth shifted. Ethan fell to his knees, his heart racing. The sky above him darkened, the clouds swirling like a vortex. The dead were stirring, calling to him, reaching for him with their cold, bony hands. And in that moment, Ethan understood the truth. He would never be free. The Strathmore legacy had bound him to its cursed history, and no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would always be haunted by the dead, always hunted by the legacy that refused to die. As the darkness closed in around him, Ethan felt a chill settle in his bones. He had broken the cycle, yes, but in doing so, he had awakened something far worse, something that could never be undone. And so, as the world around him twisted into nightmare, Ethan's last thought was a quiet, desperate prayer. Let the dead rest. This expanded version of Chapter 10 gives the story a darker, more sinister conclusion. blending the eerie presence of Victoria Strathmore with Ethan's realization that no matter what he did, the legacy would haunt him forever. It closes the loop on the Strathmore family's curse while keeping the supernatural, haunting atmosphere that defines the novel. The Forgotten Legacy. Epilogue. The winds howled through the remains of the Strathmore estate, tearing at the rubble of what had once been a grand mansion, a dark monument to wealth and power that now lay reduced to little more than shattered stone, broken wood and dust. The storm had passed, but its fury remained in the air, heavy with the scent of old blood and broken promises. Ethan stood at the edge of the wreckage, staring into the distance, his thoughts as tangled and restless as the ruins before him. He had come here seeking truth, believing that the Strathmore legacy, the twisted pact with the dead, could be severed. He had come to end it, to free those bound to the curse, and to rid the world of the horrific hold the Strathmores had over the dead. And for a fleeting moment, it had seemed as though the storm had purged everything. The mansion had burned, the spirits had been freed, and the bonds between the living and the dead were finally severed. But the dead do not simply vanish. Ethan had hoped that when the last of the Strathmores had fallen, when the final ritual had been broken, the curse would die with them. He had wished for a clean break, for an end to the madness that had plagued the Strathmore family for centuries. But what he had discovered, in the quiet aftermath, was far worse than he could have imagined. The Strathmore legacy, their dark pact with the dead, had never truly been theirs to control. No matter how many times they had manipulated, twisted, and profited from the bodies of the dead, the truth remained. They were not the masters of death. They were merely its servants. And now, Ethan knew the same fate awaited him. The mansion was gone, and the Strathmores were dead. But that did not mean the curse had been destroyed. It had merely shifted, evolved, waiting for the next victim, waiting for the next bearer of the Strathmore name, or the next fool who thought they could break free. Ethan had been marked, not by the Strathmores, but by the very force they had tried to control. And now, it was too late to escape. The whispers had started slowly at first, barely perceptible, like the rustle of wind through dry leaves, or the faint echo of distant voices in a crowded room. He had dismissed them, of course. He had believed that with the Strathmore's downfall, with the mansion reduced to ash, the curse would finally dissipate. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became impossible to ignore. They spoke of death, of betrayal, of unfulfilled promises and ancient debts. And then, one night, as Ethan lay in bed, unable to sleep, the whispers came for him directly. You thought you could break the cycle. You thought you could free them. But the curse never ends, Ethan. Not for you. Not for anyone. The voice was unmistakable, soft, hollow, like the echo of a memory long forgotten. It was Victoria Strathmore's voice, the last living Strathmore, whose soul he had believed to have been freed when he severed the pact. But Victoria had never truly been freed. None of them had. The Strathmores had believed that by claiming the rights to the dead, they had become gods over life and death. They had thought they could harness the souls of the deceased, use them as pawns in their game of power. But all they had done was bind themselves to a curse that had no end. The curse was not just about controlling the dead. It was about control, about power, about a hunger that could never be satisfied. Victoria had been the last to fall, the last to fully understand the extent of the pact they had made. She had offered Ethan a choice: join her, embrace the legacy, and become a part of the Strathmore legacy, forever, or refuse, and face the consequences. Ethan had chosen to break the pact, to destroy the ritual, to set the spirits free. But in doing so, he had only fractured the cycle, leaving it to reform in a new, more insidious way. The dead were never truly gone. They had only been displaced, waiting for the next victim. And now, Ethan had become that victim. It wasn't long before the first sign appeared. A flicker of shadow in the corner of his vision. A figure in the distance, standing just at the edge of his sight, but never quite close enough to be fully seen. It was always there, lurking just out of reach. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or his mind playing cruel games with him. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The shadows were growing, closing in on him, suffocating him, and with each passing day, He heard more whispers, voices in the dark, calling his name, demanding his attention. The Strathmores were dead. The mansion was gone. But the curse had not ended. It was still there, waiting. The dead were not bound to a place, a body, or a name. They were bound to something far older, something far more insidious. The legacy of the Strathmores and the blood they had spilled. As time wore on, the whispers grew louder. More voices joined in. Voices he didn't recognize. Souls he had never met, but whose pain and suffering he could feel as though they were his own. They were reaching for him, pulling him back into the darkness, pulling him into the abyss he had tried so hard to escape. Ethan had tried to live a normal life, away from the ruins of the Strathmore estate. He had taken on new work, moved to a different town, and even started a family, hoping to distance himself from the horrors of the past. But no matter where he went, the curse followed. It was as if he were tethered to the dead, chained to their unfulfilled desires. Every night, as he lay in bed, he could feel their presence in the darkness, their cold touch on his skin, their voices in his ears. "You cannot escape us, Ethan. We are the shadows that follow you. We are the weight on your soul. We will never leave you." And then came the dreams. Terrifying, vivid dreams that seemed too real to be mere figments of his imagination. Dreams where the dead rose from their graves, where the Strathmore mansion stood tall again, its doors creaking open to welcome him back. Dreams where Victoria Strathmore was standing before him, her cold, dead eyes fixed on him as she whispered the same words over and over. "You will never be free." Ethan had tried everything to escape. He had tried to bury the past, to forget what he had done, to deny the reality of the curse that now gripped him. But the more he tried to escape, the stronger the pull became. The Strathmore's legacy was not just a family name. It was a curse, a bond that could never be broken. One night, as the whispers reached their peak, Ethan realized the horrifying truth. The dead had never needed the Strathmores to maintain their hold over the living. It had never been about the family. It had always been about the pact, the ritual, the control. The Strathmores had been nothing more than instruments in a much larger design. The legacy was not theirs to end. It was part of a much older, darker force. A force that had no end, no beginning, and no mercy. And now, it had claimed him. Ethan knew that he could never escape. The curse was not something you could break, not something you could outrun. It had no beginning, no end. It was eternal, bound by blood and death. And so he found himself caught in the web of the Strathmore legacy, a legacy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Ethan's life became a twisted reflection of the past. He could never escape the shadows, the whispers, the cold touch of the dead. The legacy was always with him, waiting for the moment it would claim him fully. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone, the whispers would start again. Soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "You are ours, Ethan, forever." And so, the legacy of the Strathmores lived on, not in the ruins of a mansion, but in the heart of a man who could never escape his fate. The dead were never gone. They were only waiting for the next soul to claim. The end. This extended epilogue emphasizes the eternal nature of the curse and Ethan's inescapable fate. The haunting voice of the Strathmores, the unbreakable bond with the dead, and the relentless pursuit of the curse create a chilling conclusion to the story. Ethan's attempt to move on only deepens his entanglement in the curse, and the legacy of the Strathmores continues to follow him in the most insidious way.